This podcast is about entrepreneurship, spirituality, and self-care. My name is Lourdes, and I am the host of the show. Thank you for listening today. Welcome back. And in today's episode, I have a special guest, and his name is Ben Stimpson. Ben is an integrative therapist, spiritual director, award-winning author, podcaster, and independent scholar of folklore and history. He is a member of the modern, NeoPagan, and queer communities. Ben's personal life helps to inform his professional research work. Ben holds a BA honors in medieval, classical, and religious studies from the University of Waterloo, a postgraduate diploma of spiritual psychotherapy, and a diploma in social service work. As a therapist, he excels in working with members of the queer community and other marginalized populations and ascribes to transpersonal, systemic, and narrative approaches to therapy. And folks, he does have a podcast of his own, and he is host of Essence Podcasts. It's a weekly show interviewing fellow authors and practitioners in the field of alternative spirituality and therapy. His debut title, Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices, was released by Llewellyn Worldwide and won the 2024 Gold Medal at the COVR Awards. His upcoming second title, Wise Ones, Legends of Witches, Magicians, and Cunning Folk of England and Wales, is set to debut in June 2025 through Cross Crow Books. And now let's go ahead and welcome Ben. Ben, it's so nice to meet you finally. And how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic myself. It's nice and sunny here in Kansas, and it puts me in a great mood. So,
See, my weather that I just love is overcast and a little bit drizzly, but not too dark, but not too cold. Just kind of just right and cozy. And we've had that a few times over the past couple of days. So it was a productive writing weekend for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
That sounds like very relaxing, and stay home and write, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about your book, A Guide to Developing Ancestral Veneration Practices.
So it's always interesting when I talk to people who are more kind of like in the therapy world versus people who are more in the psychic mediumship world, because I feel like people who are our listeners for this podcast are going to get that there are sentient spirits out there. There are the spirits of the dead around. And yet we're caught in this very Western paradigm of still seeing the dead as being kind of over the hill, someplace elsewhere, somewhere other than here, right? And when we look around the world, the majority of cultures have ancestral work as part of their spiritual traditions. So I started writing this during the pandemic, Ancestral Whispers, a guide to building ancestral veneration practices, mainly because of a lot of the work that I did previously over the past, 4 years before that. So I started writing down, I put pen to paper in January 2021. Obviously, we were in the pandemic at the time. And a lot of the kind of emphasis in it is how someone can develop a relationship with their dead or with other forms of ancestor, because they're not just the dead that we're working with in this book. There are all sorts of other forms of ancestor. How people can start to develop a spiritual practice. And a lot of the my own experiences inform the book, particularly working in kind of non-Western spiritual traditions like Caribbean traditions and Hinduism, and even like really reconnecting with kind of older European ways of approaching the dead. And so the book is a practical guide. It's hands-on. It takes you through all the various practices with the caveat that it's up to you to develop your practice based on your relationship with your ancestors. A lot of people are interested, like they'll watch the movie Coco and really love the spirituality of Dia de los Muertos, and try to emulate that very specifically Mexican practice with ancestors who either were never part of like that culture or never went visited Mexico, right? So it doesn't make sense to work with their dead in that way. So the question is always there, this culture does this culture does that. This is how these people connect with their dead. How can you connect with your dead? How can you build those relationships within your cultural contexts? And that's always a fun one, particularly in North America, because people have such diverse backgrounds now. How are you connecting with, this group of ancestors and this group of ancestors if they come from very different cultures, right? And so the question is always posed. So it's been out for it's been out for a year, actually. It came out exactly a year ago. And it seems like a lot of people are really resonating with that and resonating with the fact that they can do it. They can build these relationships without it being a theoretical or intellectual exercise.
So what inspired you to write this type of book? What gave you that inspiration?
Well, it's kind of a weird thing because I didn't I've always wanted to write a book, but I never thought I would have the wherewithal. I had actually developed a course around working with the dead and working with the ancestors from more of a psychotherapeutic point earlier that year. And in 2020, I actually ran a group online with some students and clients. And like kind of the conversation and the sharing that came out of that really inspired me to then, okay, I can write this into something that's mobile, that somebody can pick up. Again, a lot of it came from my own experiences 5 years before. I started training in psychotherapy up here in Toronto area in 2017, 2018. And I finished my training 4 months just before the pandemic started. So that was a big thing. But part of that training involved me doing heavy research into my family and my life to look at family patterns and to look at kind of the traumas that have come down the generations, but also the strengths, also the stories, also the relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
And while I was doing that was called a genogram, looking at kind of plotting the family history over time and seeing what patterns have come through and down into my life through my parents and grandparents and so forth. I was also involved in spiritual tradition where ancestor veneration and ancestor worship was a big thing. And a lot of Westerners, I think, have an aversion to that word worship because it's like, well, only God should be worshipped, right?
Right.
But when you look around the world, the majority of like that fine line between deity and spirit is very mixed, right? In Chinese culture, for example, like really old style Taoist and Confucian religion. The first ancestor, the head of the family, the patriarch of the family or the matriarch of the family becomes a god or goddess of that family. So there's really a lot of cultural hang-ups around that. So in this spiritual tradition I was working with, the dead were always there. They were part of the universe. They were in the house. There was a shrine to them. At the time, I was also living with my godfather in that tradition. He was my roommate. And so our practice was an everyday practice. Put some food down for the dead, light a candle for the dead, work with the dead, which is very different from kind of mediumship where you'd go to a psychic or a medium and have a conversation, but then go home afterwards, right?
Yeah.
So it was so those experiences plus the psychotherapy experience really cemented for me, I can do something with this. And so I wanted to present something to an audience that was looking and seeking that form of relationship and that form of spiritual practice, but didn't know how. So I started writing the book, came out last year, and here we are.
Yeah. So that's very fascinating. So do you think that like a past, a deceased great grandmother and grandmother, and I too believe that the dead is not
dead. They are around us, and they are just in a different dimension that we can't see or feel at the moment, or maybe you might get that experience. However, I believe they are still alive. So do you think like a great grandmother or a past relative is part of a guide that can help you today? With psychotherapy even.
Oh, absolutely. And I experienced it. I actually experienced it while I was doing my genogram, while I was doing my family history work. When you go down, if anybody's ever gone onto ancestry.com and gone down that rabbit hole of like finding and building a family tree, you start to get into this weird headspace where it's no longer just names and dates on a page. You start to see stories coming out. You start to get little hints at what might have happened 200 years ago between individuals. Records start to give you an idea of, okay, something was happening here. One of the most tragic was, and this is a regular thing that everybody will find when they eventually go back far enough, is you start to see women who they'll have had 13 or 14 children, and half of them will have died very early, right?
Right.
And I came across that. And that's cross-cultural. Like everybody will eventually find that if they go back far enough, because that was how the world was, 150 years, 200 years ago. Child mortality was such a huge thing. And the wave of sadness that came up when I started to see those stories, and being kind of like, in tune with my emotions and having gone through therapy myself because of my program, I could tell this wasn't my feeling. I was sad for this person I was reading about, but the wave of sadness that I was feeling was something else. It was something bigger than me. It was coming from that person I was connecting with. I also had some very spooky situations with kind of synchronicities around this time. I went to an event called a Dumb Supper, which is becoming a big thing in North America here. It's that going to almost like a seance in many ways. You go and you sit with the dead and with other people sitting with their dead in almost like a cafe style situation. And I was working in a bakery at the time, and I was like, okay, well, I have to bring something to this event because it's potluck. So I grabbed a load of butter tarts, which for those international viewers or listeners who don't know what butter tarts are like this really rich pastry filled with like, gooey caramel. It's beautiful. And I mean, I could have gotten pies, I could have gotten anything. I was working in a bakery, it was anything, but I picked these butter tarts. And when I presented them to the person who was running the Dumb Supper, she burst out into tears. And I said, well, I know they're half price, but like, we're still good, right? She said, you don't. I was really hoping that my dad would come through at this Dumb Supper coming up. Or silent cafe is the other term for it. She ran one previously that day, just a few hours earlier, and he hadn't come through. And me presenting these butter tarts, she said butter tarts were his favorite.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I had a visceral feeling of, something bigger than me was like, had a hand in this situation.
Yeah.
So I had all of those sorts of things. So I definitely, I do believe that the dead are constantly guiding us. In the tradition that I practice, we don't tend to see them as spiritual, as spirit guides, though. In kind of the spiritism tradition that I practice, we tend to see a little bit of a difference there. So the dead have at least we believe, the dead have a certain agenda. They want the family to continue. They want life to continue. They want us to continue. And so they will intercede on our behalf in order to get us to the best place that we can be, in order to fulfill that goal of supporting the continuation of life on Earth, right? Whereas spirit guides, they tend to be not related to us, so they have our personal best interests at heart. And I think that's really important. It's like you wouldn't necessarily go to your great like aunt who's a really good listener for therapy, because you need that sort of that distinction there in order to really go deep into certain things. But you certainly would go to your great aunt to be, somebody that you can vent to. There's a
Mhm.
slightly different relationship there, right? So I hope that answers the question. I do definitely believe that they have connection with us. And that's really the whole point of ancestor veneration, is that you're building that relationship with them in order to get something back, but also in a respectful way. In Chinese culture, I know Chinese culture particularly because it was one of my case studies I really dived into, but it speaks generally to a lot of Asian cultures. This idea that if you don't give grandma or grandfather honored elders, an offering of money or food or whatever, they're going to become very upset with you because you're forgetting them. And that's not something you do with your elders. And so they will start to make noise. It's like, going to a kitchen when you're being passive aggressive, banging things about you. It's something that it's that remembrance piece. Remember your elders because your descendants will then remember you. It's that continuation of the kind of the world, the universal way of being, right? So yes, I definitely think they have intercessions in our lives.
Yeah. So, do you think Christianity, and especially the Catholic Church, kind of gets in this way because you're taught that there's only one God and you die and you die. And so if you believe in this other past generational, veneration of the dead, does that seem to interfere with Christian beliefs as a stigma of some sort?
I think it depends what kind of Christian you are. This is what I've noticed. So when you look at a lot of Catholic countries, particularly in South America, in Southern Europe, and not so much Africa anymore. Well, maybe Africa, I'll say. That's starting to change. But certainly in Asia, definitely. The reason that a lot of Catholic countries tend to have a lot of kind of ancestor work also as part of the culture is because of the idea of veneration of saints. This idea that the dead are able to intercede on your behalf by going to God, right? So the idea of the belief of saints in particular is just another form of ancestor veneration. You're venerating a dead saint because you believe that they have the ear of God. But of course, when it comes to Catholic theology, everybody can become a saint. Everybody can become a saint because everybody, has that connection up there, right? Yeah. And so I think that it's easier in Catholic countries, particularly when the colonialism was happening and missionaries were converting people. There was a lot more that allowed for syncretism to happen, and so then we get secondary folk religions, right, or secondary traditions retained within those cultures. So if you go down to Brazil, for example, very, very Catholic country, you have African traditions, you have Native South American traditions, you have, Spiritism traditions all over the place. It's the Protestant form of Christianity, which I think has caused a lot of issues and which I think then has led to modern Western society being very disconnected because in that Protestant view, there is only one God. Like even Trinitarianism is awkward for a lot of Protestant churches. They tend to be very schismatic. So whenever somebody has, a melodramatic meltdown over, one word in the King James version of the Bible, suddenly a whole new church is founded and that's it, right? It also tends to be part and parcel with individualism. And individualism, I think, is really what's caused a lot of Westerners to be disconnected from their dead. In Catholicism particularly, the focus is on the community, and that's the majority of the world is focused on community and family in particular, however way you want to define family. Whereas Protestantism, particularly Lutheranism and Protestantism in North America in particular, the essence is on personal salvation, on personal relationship with God. And what we see in the United States right now with this idea of this weird evangelical movement of, individual for freedom, individual finance, individual, right?
Mm.
In which case, then, what purpose would a relationship be with a vast community of dead spirits? Doesn't make any sense. There's also a certain kind of psychologizing, making of archetypes, making of unreal the spiritual in Protestantism, particularly, because it's all just archetypal, it's all nonsense. It, focus on God, right? So I think that also plays a part in it. And I talk about that in the book. Look at the modern funeral industry, for example.
Yeah.
When somebody dies, what happens is their body is taken away to the coroner. You get it back a few days later or a week later, and depending upon your religion, and it's done up, it's makeup, it's backlit with, in a beautiful $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 casket, and then that's it, and then it's placed into the ground. Whereas in older communal cultures, particularly Catholicism, the tending to the dead would be done at home. The body would be washed by the family or by somebody coming into the home to wash the body. Right, death was a communal family event, and the community would come into the family home. Now we have funeral homes where it's completely out and separated. And so when you look at South American and in Southern European cultures, right, African cultures, Asian cultures, wherever, that trend of the family and it being a home event is a strong thing. It's only in Western cultures, and those cultures that are now being heavily influenced by kind of capitalism and Western influence is starting to shift, particularly weirdly in like Ghana. This is a weird thing I came across. People are spending like, $20,000 on a casket in Ghana because they want to be seen as rich, and that's really that Western influence coming in of,
Yeah.
It's very strange. But anyways, that's a whole rabbit hole we can go down later on.
No, but it's true. I mean, the funeral industry in America, North America, particularly I'm talking about United States, is very good marketing. Very good marketing.
Yeah.
I remember when I was growing up, a little boy was killed and the family took his body in, and we had to visit them in their house with the deceased child in their home. That's how it was.
Yeah.
And here in the United States, it's so different. And it also makes it, to me, having a funeral at a funeral home, it made, when I was growing up, I was terrified of seeing a casket.
Totally.
It was a
Absolutely.
fear-based.
Yeah.
And even it only took me maybe 20, 25 years ago when I wasn't so scared of looking at a casket or a person in a casket. It's fear-based also, isn't it?
Very much fear-based, right?
Yeah.
Because when we're not used to seeing, and I think this is true for even mediums, right?
Yes.
There's a certain level of control because they're still invisible to spirits. But there's still that level of fear of even going, oh, what will the psychic tell me? What will the medium tell me? Oh, right. And yet,
yeah.
It's ridiculous, right? And I think we can even see it in how we even talk about the dead. Right. I mean, and I know that, the dead are very much still there. You know. But when we talk about in a general social sense, we don't talk about them. They become past tense. They become other. We're afraid to say their voices, particularly for those who have suicided, for example, right? We're afraid to say their names because, we don't want to upset anybody. Right. Well, you're upsetting the dead by doing that, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right. For sure. So who generally reads your books? What audience would read your book?
It's kind of shifted. So originally this book was intended to be kind of more psychotherapeutic. And then I was like, you know what? No, this is for the people who are looking for a spiritual practice. This is for people who are looking to do something, because I think the issue with a lot of kind of particularly New Age spirituality is that it's very mental, it's very theoretical, it's very in our heads, it's very Protestant in many ways. And I think that the vibrancy of spirituality, particularly, is in the doing, right? It's in the color, it's in the communication, it's in the singing, it's in the vibrancy of it all. And so I think this is why people want to celebrate and do things, you know. I think about like Catholicism, when you enter an old Catholic church and the walls are filled with color, and you know, you've got processions and people wearing, you know, huge big costumes and things like that. It suspends the disbelief. It allows us to enter into a different kind of tactile relationship, right? So I think that this is driving the idea of why people want things to do and rituals to do and things to perform, but they don't know or don't have those because of the way that Western society has eliminated many of those things, right? I think over the past few years, you know, we've particularly seen with younger people a real interest in, you know, like the old kind of Victorian going and having picnics in the cemetery and, you know, spending time with the dead, things like that. I think there's a lot of interest in the, you know, the various Day of the Deads that happen around the world. I think this is also why Halloween is such a really important thing for younger generations, because it allows them that connection point to death. While also celebrating it, right? So the people who are reading this book, they are looking for things to do. And in fact, one of the main criticisms is that I don't give them enough to do. So I'm planning a sequel where I will fill it with actual rituals and actual things that they can do. Yeah. But what this does is it takes you through kind of the various aspects of a living spiritual tradition. So, you know, in constructing an altar, in constructing prayers, going on pilgrimage, using food and using color, how can that be used to communicate with the dead? Because ultimately, for me, all ritual is communication. You're communicating with something, whether it be another human or spirit or God or whoever. You're using that symbolic language of nuance. And so the people who are reading this are looking for that. I think also a lot of people, you know, they've gone down the ancestry.com rabbit hole in the past, you know, 20 or 30 years. People are finding or looking for roots, particularly in North America, where so many people who are not Native American, they don't have long roots in the country, right? They may have roots that only go back a few decades. They may have roots that go back a few hundred years, but that's it. And so trying to find roots for themselves, particularly with how turbulent the world is becoming, is a really important thing. And one of the best ways to do that is to get back to basics, which is to do things, right? So those are the types of people. And I'm not bragging here, but it seems to be really enjoyed. I sold 1,500 copies of it so far, and it only came out a year ago. So I feel like it's doing pretty good for a very niche subject like this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Very, very fascinating, of course. And guess what? I'm going to be buying the book soon, too. So, yeah. I mean, just talking to you about this is even more fascinating than what I've read in the synopsis of the book. So quickly, you do psychotherapy and you're also a spiritual director.
Yes.
Do people ever go to you because they believe they are cursed?
Some people do.
Can they be cursed? Can they be cursed then?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
So this is where I have to be very careful, like what hat I'm sitting with. If people come to me for psychotherapy work, then, you know, it would not be appropriate for me to be saying, "Oh, you're cursed. This is what you need to do."
Correct.
Things like that. It's really how is their relationship with this idea that they're cursed? How is it affecting their life? How is it affecting their narrative? How it's affecting how they show up to the world, right? Versus spiritual direction or magical work, which I also do, which is that more prescriptive subscribing. I think people can definitely be cursed, but I think also quite a bit of it is people curse themselves because of the idea that they're cursed. And I think that's a very powerful form of curse. If you believe, that power of belief is really important, really big. If you believe that somebody has cursed you, then in your reacting to that idea, you get in your own way. Now, that also being said, I also do believe in curses and how and people throwing magic at each other. In which case, then there are simpler remedies to that. Things like, spiritual baths, placing mirrors in windows to reflect things back out from your house, that kind of thing. Going to your guides to be, and those spiritual intermediaries to be those bouncers that will step in and be like, no, you don't get to do that. You can keep your curse over there. Right? So
I belong to a few mediumship circles, and there are some people that go in there and we believe they're scammers, and they use fear-based, and they say,
yes,
oh, you are cursed. Call me because I can remove any curses or ancestral curses. So that's my question. Are there ancestral curses that did not belong to you in this lifetime, but you inherited from before?
No.
Okay. Good
Unequivocally, no. My experience, so yes, and I mean, let's be honest here. This is a big thing that happens. And we often see this with writers and with, popular mediums and other spiritual workers, where scam artists will impersonate them and clone their accounts and then approach.
Yes.
And the line very much is, and I'm not, it's a proof here that they often tend to be in places like Nigeria and
Correct.
South America and South Asia, right?
Yes.
This whole idea of stepping forward, be like, oh, your ancestors, they tell me that I have blessing for you, right?
Right.
So I trained I didn't initiate, but I was heavily involved in an African tradition, Lukumi Santeria. And a lot of the Ifa practitioners or the scammers who are trying to say, I'm an Awo from Nigeria and your ancestors are telling me blah, blah. I often will just report like, no, dude, you're not, right? Because no. People need to be wary of stuff like that. You don't need to spend $10,000. You don't need to spend $1,000. You don't need to spend $50 for a curse removal, right? Any good magical practitioner will prescribe certain things for you that you can do in order to remove curses or hexes from you. What you're paying for is that person's time, but somebody's time is not going to be in the hundreds or even the thousands, right? A person's time for an hour or half an hour, right, should only ever be less than 100. And that's just for, like any other kind of practitioner you're sitting with, you're spending time with them, right? With ancestors particularly, this is what I've experienced with ancestors, is that people will often say, well, there's an ancestral curse because this particular ancestor was an asshole. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. is not a nice person, right? So what do we do when we have family situations and somebody is not a nice person, right? In life, we can't escape them because, there's nobody above them. But in the ancestral sense, there are layers upon layers upon layers. If you don't like, or if you believe that one of your ancestors is cursing you, you go to their mother or their grandmother or their auntie or whoever is going to like whip them upside the head, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the ancestors, my experience with the ancestors is that they want life to continue and proliferate. The type of ancestors that become issues are the type that then these relationships that you build with your other ancestors can mitigate. They will come in and they will take their kid home, right?
Wow.
Does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's
so no, if somebody emails you and says, I want to give you a blessing, your ancestors have a gift for you, whatever, I'd be curious and I would just block. Don't be a fool when it comes to that, and don't give anybody any money.
Exactly. So, so when somebody contacts you and needs a spiritual direction, and using your spiritual direction experience, what is the process of that? How does that look?
So spiritual direction is very different from, say, mediumship. If I were to do a reading for somebody, where it's very much more, this is what the cards are saying, or this is what my spirit guides are saying, and this is the message that's coming through. At that point, it's just a channel. With spiritual direction, it's much more like couples therapy. And I often like to say it's much more like couples therapy between you and God, or you and your spirit, so you and the world, right? It's not therapy in that we're not looking at issues and how to go deep diving into issues and solve those issues. What we're looking at is relationship. So like one of my clients I'm working with right now is, sometimes their own therapy stuff comes in, but our focus is really on their relationship to themselves and that relationship then to God. And, this idea of voice, a big thing we've been working on is around voice, around how voice is sometimes it's a channel for something bigger than her, right? And then sometimes it's a form of expression for herself, and knowing the difference between those things and when she wants to use each of those different types of expression, and so that's when that's spiritual direction. I'm asking good questions to get the person to deepen their relationship. And it doesn't matter what religion or spirituality or whatever that they, or tradition that they're practicing, because the questions are always the same, right? If your relationship to, I don't know, Mother Mary, and how are you relating to that figure of Mother Mary? I'm going to be asking the same questions of somebody if they're having a relationship with Shiva or Vishnu or Ganesh or their spirit guides, what they know of their spirit guides, and the question would be like, how are you feeling about this relationship? What is the communication like between you two? How do they show up in your life, and how do then you show up in your life, right? That's very different from a reading of, okay, Mother Mary wants you to go and do this thing at this Catholic church later on, right? Or, whatever it is, right?
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds very therapeutic. Because
it's very therapeutic. Yeah.
It's very deep dive to me, is what you're saying.
It is.
Deep dive.
It is. But whereas therapy is about looking at, again, kind of going into issues and being like, okay, what patterns in your what narratives in your life are you running through? How does maybe mental illness or stress play into that? With spiritual direction, it's entirely about relationship. So it is a lot more like couples therapy than individual therapy in that way. And of course, then I have to be very ethically conscious of, where is my hat in this? Somebody's coming to me for spiritual direction, and it really looks like they could do with personal therapy around some of those issues that they're bringing. Then it's my ethical responsibility to refer them out to somebody else for the therapy work. We can continue our spiritual direction work, but then they need that separate space for them to go and explore the therapy aspect through a modality like CBT or tapping or narrative therapy or whatever, right? In the same way, if, with mediumship too, if I'm sitting and reading and a message comes through and they are exhibiting signs that this is not going to be okay for them because of some mental health stuff going on, I might, in that capacity, be like, okay, I notice these things, if you're interested, here's a referral, but only if they ask for it, because that's not why they're there, right? Yeah. Right. So ethics comes into it all, and I have to be very wary of kind of what role I'm playing in all of that. And I do wish more people would sometimes think about that. I think that there's a lot of training programs for various different forms of either spiritual directional therapy, or now, like tarot training programs are talking more about this too, because there's a lot more of an interest in tarot as archetype. And so I'll use tarot in my therapy work, but I'm not reading for them. I'm using it as a form of archetypal, like, narrative work, right? So, let's do a card pull. Oh, you got the Tower. Okay, how are you connecting with the Tower card? Right? Regardless of what that might mean to me in the reading, we're looking more at how they're reacting or taking in that Tower card, right? Whereas in a reading, I would be like, oh, girl,
Yeah. Very interesting. Yes, integrity and ethics come very, very highly recommended for people like you and me who are more, I don't know, we're ethically conscious of delivering good messages to people to really make them feel better and move forward. So I am getting to the part of my podcast where I ask a funny or weird question.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay. All right, Ben. So what keeps you up at night about the mysteries of the universe and the unknown? Would it be the possibility of extraterrestrial life, the nature of consciousness and the afterlife, or the origins of the universe and the meaning of life?
I think the last two are really connected. The nature of consciousness and the meaning of life is something that, as I age, and I turned 38 last week.
Oh, happy birthday. Happy belated birthday.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was, it's a weird sort of feeling because it's like, it's only 38, but it's still, as I age and particularly as I get more into my writing and deepening my spiritual practice, those questions of, okay, what's coming in next? Like, what is next? What is happening? And it does keep me up at night because I think the more I learn, the more I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I wish I was like 22 again. Right. Sorry. Go on.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I keep thinking more about my life lessons and my life path and kind of what I was sent here to do. Because I do believe in soul contract. I do believe that we come into this earth to learn and to grow. And this is what the ancestors are telling me too, right? Yeah. And my spirit guides. So, but then I'm like, okay, if I do all of this and then I start all over again, my attachment to this life versus that thought of, okay, I'm gonna start all of this over again in the next life sometime, right? Or like when I leave this place, I've started watching a lot more out-of-body experience videos on YouTube for some wonderful channels, just to get a sense of, okay, I believe very much that there is a life after this. So then what's after that? What's after that? What's after that? That's where then it leads to that question of what's the purpose of all of this? So then I feel very, very small. And I don't think people like to feel small. I certainly don't.
No.
So I hope that wasn't too serious a question for a silly question. It was a good question, though.
No, not at all. I enjoyed your answer very much. So, Ben, where can people connect with you and find you?
Yeah, everything is on my website, benstimpson.com. I have a podcast on there. I have various information about my book on there and future projects. Some of my services are on there too. I also have on Instagram, Facebook, and somewhere else. Anyways, I'm out there. I'm on the internet somewhere. But benstimpson.com is where you can find me.
Yeah. So, wow. So this has been very good conversation.
Thank you.
I love learning about what you do and more about you. And you're a very pleasant person to speak with. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast today.
You are so welcome. This was a delight. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
I hope that you enjoyed this podcast, and please share this episode with your friends. Please subscribe, rate, and review this episode. And as always, the show notes will be available at 8thlevelpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.